God, things are getting bad in terms of OCD. One surefire sign that they're getting bad in terms of OCD is when in your prelude, like you think in advance what you want the main course of the video to be and what you want your prelude to the video to be. And it just increasingly I catch myself with my preludes. That's why I didn't upload the last one that I mentioned I would upload at the end of the video. I just said, no, just leave this out. The video is long enough. It's because within my preludes, I use it as a springboard, not to the topic itself, but for these other preludes. So I can't even haggle properly with what I want to keep out versus into the video. Like, forget just the main course, but even like with my appetizers, I contradict myself. The story I tell myself in my head before I click the record button, this is what I'm going to talk about. Like, I'm so springboard prone these days that I can't even contain that stuff just when we're talking about these preludes to what the real topic of the video is going to be. And the ideal fix is just don't think in terms of uploading anything, because what happens is when you reserve any amount of your space, your cognitive space and energy, to sorting out your thoughts for this is the sort of thing I'm going to talk about at some point in a video in the future versus not. When you do that, you partition the topics, and then those topics that you choose to say to yourself, like, well, maybe these things won't be discussed in a video. This is just what I'm going to do in my private audios, thinking out loud sort of stuff. Like if that's not on my to-do list, then I'm just not going to think as meticulously about those sorts of things, and it's a mistake, because I should think about everything, irrespective of whether it's going to end up in a video. I should think about everything in about as detailed way as possible. And just the fact that I'm sitting here talking about stuff that goes through my brain before versus what happens after the record button is clicked, how often do you hear people get into this? Now, is it because they view themselves as these equivalent to like magicians, and they don't want to reveal their thought process because they view it as on par with a magician revealing his antics? Like, it can't be that. They can't be up their own ass to that extent. Just like as vloggers, or as if they're speakers, right? This can go for non-vlog speakers as well. So it can't be that. The reason you never hear people talk about this is the things they think they want to say before they click record versus after. It's because everything is just so drone-ish. Everything is so teleprompter, and here I can use the teleprompter non-literally. I can use it metaphorically, because that's the big problem with the teleprompter. Every now and then you'll hear someone, usually in the American political scene, say something negative about teleprompter. But to me, the literal story about the teleprompter is nowhere near as interesting and as sad as the metaphorical story. People just staying in their own lanes, not swimming in the deep end of the pool. And that's the springboard, actually. But I don't want to get into the springboard yet. That's going to be the springboard to what I think that we, as, let's say, media savvy or digital culture literate people, that's where the kind of dividing lines should be. People unwilling to venture out of the kind of path of least resistance, versus people who are like, give me the path of the harshest resistance. Just in terms of what's going to, not just even in terms of engagement, but in terms of a lot of just the amount of shit you're gonna have to put yourself through to get toward the end of a point you want to make. Like maybe even focusing on segues. Sometimes I'm in my perspective video making mode, and I just do these kinds of segues that I'm like, oh shit, I wish I could pull these off during the video itself, because the segue adds something. It's hard to put into words what a decent segue adds. And then I get home and I'm recording something and I'm like, what is missing? Like, yeah, technically I'm hitting all the same points as I did when I was thinking about this issue hours before I clicked the record button. Like, what is missing? And for months I didn't realize, like, why exactly am I dissatisfied in some cases? Yes, by the time I get back home, I'm exasperated, I'm recuperating, so I can't be as on as I am when I'm at work and drinking the caffeine stuff. That's why I decided to have it handy with me. Maybe it'll keep me fired up throughout the whole process. But just earlier this week, it finally dawned on me, is like, you may be able to recapture the points, but certain segues, it's like when you have it as a one-off. And if you try to recreate it, then it's artificial because there's nothing spontaneous about it. You just want to recapture a kind of almost like a majestic seeming segue, And the moment you're trying to recapture it, it's no longer a segue, it's artifice. And so the fact that you'd never hear anyone who's in the business of either giving a speech or pressing a record button to upload it, that just shows how dronish and hollow their thought process behind this is. There's nothing artistic about it. Like, they almost really do view it as a job, and I feel that they would view it as a job even if they didn't have Patreons to plug. They would view it as this kind of job of persuasion, and that if whatever that demo says lends itself to you being more persuasive, you'll just fill in that role. It'll become a kind of demographic task. Like, you'll get a demographer to tell you what your viewers are into or your prospective viewers might be into, and then you'll just fill that niche because you want to be persuasive. But I want to be persuasive a la the path of most resistance, not the path of least resistance. I would never in a million years try to get like some psychometrician to evaluate the types of people who are most likely to click and keep paying attention to my videos, and then just to have that psychometrician tell me like what I need to do in order to kind of maybe almost deceive those people into being tricked into thinking that they agree with me fully. Like, no, if you're gonna agree with me fully, it should happen like even if I'm literally spitting on the camera lens and telling you that I wish the camera lens were you because I want to spit in your face because I just dislike you that much. If I make the good point, like, there really is no amount of unflattery that should be willing to tilt you over the edge to not agreeing with me if you actually agree with my points. But flattery is pretty much the opposite story in the way everyone else thinks about persuasion. Flattery does a lot of work. And when I said in the last video, this is still a part of my prelude for this video, by the way, but that's just the way it goes. I need to make some corrections for the things I said in the last video. I said things like dumbing down effect, and I said things like keep it simple, stupid. That's just me in the heat of the moment. I don't actually mean that the Jacobin guy wants to dumb things down or keep things stupid. That's a crass way of putting it. What that is seizing upon a certain type of gullibility in the broader public that can even work on an exceptionally intelligent person, right? And what that seizes upon is applying flattery as a persuasive tool. And this doesn't have to be personal flattery. In the case of the Jacobin guy, it very much is, because you just flatter some sort of grunt work profession, the blue-collar profession. You portray those as being in some way more respectable or in some way more virtuous than what the quote-unquote elites do. So in his case, he would apply a personal style flattery to ensure an electoral victory. I guess take advantage of the gullibility of the Volk. Other people would not so much seize on those personal forms of flattery, but epistemic forms of flattery. There's a way to, I think Nietzsche did this to some extent. A lot of other people do this. It's dispositionalism about belief. When you have an outgroup that you just know you don't care to persuade about anything, you can apply this, because then you can talk about how the in-group came to believe what they did not through a process of reasoning, but because they're just cut out for that sort of belief. And so I've seen, I wish I could have actually cropped up some of the quotes, but there have been numerous times where people talked about the victim mindset and victimology, and they really are telling the story about dispositionalism, about belief through it. Actually, no, victimology is not the best example to that, because there have been a number of people who have spoken about it without connecting it to dispositionalism and kind of saying, this person wants to be a victim because of some kind of essence to them. There have been a lot of people who have made good, strong criticisms of what's now come to be known as victimology. I hope to a wide enough degree that I don't even have to define it here. I'm going to assume everyone here, when I say victimology, everyone's going to know what I'm talking about. The noble victim, not exactly a new phenomenon. But there have been a lot of people who have written about it without fumbling into the other dispositionalism story, where it's just connected to some kind of core of the, there's a kind of, certain people have a certain kind of core to them, and that's what they want to be. Now, that may be a type of story about dispositionalism you might hear from bourgeois value monger, people who are pushing bourgeois values, people like Amy Wax, people like Heather MacDonald. Wax or Wax? I think it's Amy Wax. the annoying people that Glenn Loury hosts on his podcast and doesn't really give anything in the way of the kind of pushback I would give, they're on my shit list. Those two, I may at some point go back to those conversations they had with Glenn Loury and just provide the kind of response I want to provide to them that no one else does, because it's just such a glaring example of a debate where it's a push-pull, and they think that because they're reacting against the quota mongers in institutions of higher learning, and there are these quota mongers that are just absolutely deluded about the root cause of why certain groups do worse than others academically, and so I guess to put a face on it, like Ibram Kendi has been at the forefront of that. Ta-Nehisi Coates will either give a lukewarm endorsement of that or will just sit it out. You know, and Nicole Hannah-Jones, the whole 1619 thing. So like Glenn Loury comes and brings these kind of bougie people on, bourgeois value people on, Amy Wax, Heather MacDonald, and they're critiquing all this stuff, and it's just so clear that they think it's a push-pull. So the more they show that the quota mongers are wrong, the more they prove that they're 100% accurate about everything they have to say about pursuing higher education and essentially groveling around all these institutions and portraying them as something like we need the stamp of approval as people from these institutions. Whereas like I know that if I were in a debate with any of those people, and my stance would be, if Harvard or Oxford or Yale, if they just vanish as institutions right now, and I don't weep a single tear, I don't even feel a single bad emotion over it, I'm just 100% neutral on it, I have the right reactive attitude to that. And the people who either cry rivers of tears for those institutions or who are in some way trying to tell some story that this is bad for society, that these institutions are no longer in effect, that person has the wrong reactive attitude. And I would just love to separate a video exclusively for this, and I might do so sometime in the future, but it's because they've got their sights so set on these quota mongers who must have some reverence for these institutions, because they're always bean counting which group is overrepresented and underrepresented, and doing so also kind of selectively, because, well, Jews being overrepresented somehow never matters, but, you know, because that, I guess it would take an anti-Semite to worry about overrepresentation for Jews. So you just run into all kinds of selective thinking when you start counting these kinds of beans. But regardless, the reason I'm so annoyed with this topic and the people Glenn Loury brings on to debunk that is because they really do think that them saying 2 + 2 is 5 is made accurate because they so brilliantly articulate why the quota mongers saying 2 + 2 is 6 is inaccurate, right? So show how the opposing side is inaccurate beyond a shadow of a doubt, and both Amy Wax and Heather MacDonald do a brilliant job explaining why those things are wrong. When they start saying it'll be or hinting that it's going to be the downfall of Western Civ, that's where they go wrong. So I don't think it's dangerous. I just think those people are wrong. But they'll add things like dangerous and threats to that as well. But even if they didn't add it, even if they just said these people are dangerously, or not dangerously, but these people are just massively deluded, factually deluded, that even that wouldn't show that their approach to higher institution, that their 2 + 2 = 5 is made true. But when you are stuck in a push-pull mentality, it can't be anything but that. And that's what most people are stuck in. They're stuck in thinking that, like, ideologically speaking, I can't talk today. And I'm having all this coffee, but I can't talk. It's usually the opposite is supposed to happen. Okay, let's try this again. When most people believe that when I say ideologically, like 90% of that is going to be political ideologically. I think that's the kind of spot we're in right now in 2022. Whether I add that precursor of pole ideology, it just doesn't matter. People are going to link it with political ideology. And so when people do that, they believe that ideologically you can really just, you can do one of two things. You can have your views be stagnant, or you can have them shift. And if they're shifting, they can shift in one direction or in another direction. So any kind of modification to your views that you may have made, there's a bunch of not just ordinary political thinkers, but like there's political scholars who immediately lunge to the conclusion that you will have moved leftward or you will have moved rightward if your views change. The only way you're ideologically speaking, you will not have moved leftward or rightward in your movement is if you just haven't moved at all, is if you actually just remain static. But the moment you're moving in one or two directions, or you're just not moving at all. And that's how we get things like people essentially thinking that it's just so obvious that the quota monger saying 2 + 2 is 6 is wrong. Ergo, well, I have pulled and they have tried to push, and I have pulled back so hard, I've shown that I'm right to say 2 + 2 is 5. And no, you haven't, because it's not a push-pull. It's not even an up-down. It's something else altogether. And this is not to say that I've figured out that 2 + 2 is 4. I'm just pretty sure that I've figured out that it's not 5 or 6, and that it's something closer to 4. I'm probably saying 2 + 2 is 4.2, so I understand that I can have some corrections imposed upon me as well, but I also think that these kind of numerical, just putting it in these crass numerical formulas or little simplistic arithmetics, it's easier than actually re-articulating the issue itself every single time. But yeah, so this is something people absolutely need to start talking about at length, that on so many issues, and we don't even realize we're doing it. And it's not we, it's them. So I just did the we thing that I hate when other people do. It's not me, right? Maybe you, but it's not me. People need to start criticizing this. Even the temptation now is to say that it's the problem of the two-party system, but clearly people have been doing it even in countries where there's a multi-party sort of competitive political order in effect. So I don't even think that a political duopoly is what contributes to it. It's something deeper. It probably has to do with how we picture the political, ideological axis. That axis just needs to be dislodged forever, because odds are the position that's going to be the closest one to the most reasonable one or the most beneficial one is just going to be something that no one's even conceived of as of yet, and something that you can't easily situate in any kind of orthodox or heterodox slot on an axis. I'm just going to take a bit more coffee. And so it's yet another thing that is not a part of the path of least resistance that I don't see people who should know better acting upon. I stopped listening to the Sam Harris podcast where he had Douglas Murray on. I think I listened to maybe 20 minutes of that podcast. If I weren't so disorganized, I would just have those first 20 minutes queued up here to play a bit from it and respond to it. And I couldn't, because Sam is just so bought into this push-pull thing, and he's interviewing Murray along those lines, and so everything has to be within this push-pull. And he's using the terms that I've complained about before, that I said we have these eternal, evergreen, definitional impasses on, so we got to stop using the terms, and he just freely uses those terms. Douglas freely kind of goes along with the way Sam's using those terms, but who the fuck knows if they got detailed enough about what each of them means by those terms, they'd probably see that they're not using the terms in a compatible enough way. And these are all kind of the people who I would have thought way back in the day, a decade ago and before, it's good that, you know, I'm listening to these people. These people have something to tell me. And it's just so exhausting to be on this receiving end of the realization that most people have nothing to tell me. That's where I am right now. It's so hard to come across someone who is speaking. Doesn't really hold as true when it comes to those who write, but when it comes to those who just yakety yak, like, I should have stopped paying attention to them at least 2 years ago. I should have stopped paying attention to, I'd say, roughly 95% of the people that I pay attention to, that I kept paying attention to, who just do these maybe weekly or bi-weekly podcasts or some other kinds of thing because they're so hopelessly repetitive. And I just kept putting up with them, and I'm just realizing that most of the time I'm not even paying attention to them as they speak. If it's a podcast and it's something like 10 minutes in, I am in my own head just countering their faulty premises while they're still on a kind of runaway course, not having heard me debunk their faulty premises. Because of course they're not going to hear me because it's not a conversation. I am the listener. But it's like, I can't tolerate being the listener because it's just too often the case. There's a perspective that no one is aware of. There's a perspective that everyone's oblivious to. And it's just not enjoyable to listen to those kinds of conversations. And it's just amazing how many topics this is now becoming true of, where I cannot pay attention to the people. I'm like, okay, I got this podcast lined up. I got this panel lined up. It's even worse with a panel. These panels, I just listened to Real Time with Bill Maher. I still try to tolerate that to some extent. But I can't believe that this is something people think is productive. Because something no one will ever say when it comes to these panels, Mar now has like 2 panelists on, so it's 3 people at the round table. He used to have like 4 or 3 or between 3 and 4 panelists usually, which just made the problem worse. But it's a problem even when you got 3 people at a kind of round table discussion, because no one will say this, but everyone believes that it is just distasteful for someone to speak in a long-winded way. When it comes to these roundtable discussions, you're supposed to give your bite-sized comment, and then you're supposed to let the other person give their bite-sized comment, and then maybe the host will chime in with his bit, and that's just, everyone just kind of implicitly understands that that is in good taste. And if you talk for maybe a stretch of 3 minutes, or heaven forbid 5 minutes straight, well, you're hijacking the conversation, and that's not a good thing to do. But I can't make a single point I want to make without talking for like at least 5 minutes, because everything that's less long than that is just, to me, it rings more and more like sloganeering. And why would I want to add to the chorus of sloganeering? Maybe 5 minutes is an exaggeration, but it's not that much shorter. Like anytime I'm imagining myself, because this is what I do when I watch these shows now, I just imagine inserting myself in there and kind of like trying not to sound as agitated as I do in the videos, trying to sound magnanimous as I'm telling everyone like they've got everything wrong. So when you take my tonal problems, I have these tonal problems. I just sound way too irritated. So when you take that out of the equation, and it's just kind of me sounding monotone, I just know that I would elicit the kind of response that I elicit when I try to engage people in meet space or at work in a discussion. I see how their eyes just start glazing over because they've just not been initiated enough to realize that any worthwhile point is a point that can be made only within someone being long-winded, within the context of someone being long-winded and speaking in paragraphs and not in sentences. The fact that people don't understand that true insight stems from just letting each other talk in these long-winded paragraphs as opposed to snippets, that drives so much confusion. And I say that as someone who has something in the way of ADD. In the beginning section, I said OCD when it came to my being too kind of springboard prone for my preludes. Yeah, it is OCD, but it's OCD in combination with ADD. That's what ails me. And that's why I can't even do a proper like springboard to a video without derailing into other kinds of preludes that I'm meant to do for other videos. So yeah, but so it's like, but if I can understand with my ADD problems that we need as a culture to get closer to some kind of a respectable attention span and not the direction the algorithm is pulling us toward, which is attentional spanlessness. If I can understand that, having my subjective deficits in terms of attention, really people who get invited to these prestigious shows, they should absolutely be able to understand it as well. And well, in terms of all these political shows, if it's a roundtable discussion, someone should probably crack the numbers to see how often the average panelist talks, but I'd be shocked if it was more than 30 seconds, 40 seconds. And it's like, it's no one calls it a formal rule, but there is a rule. There's very much an informal rule in effect. And after you've spoken for about a minute, you shut your mouth and you let the other person say their piece. And so this tragedy, I'm going to call it a tragedy because it absolutely is, and I'm pissed off about it. What happened to Salman Rushdie last week, or was it last week? What is today? Today's Thursday, August 18th. So Salman Rushdie got stabbed a few days ago, and that's why I tuned into Mar's show, Real Time. And he had Piers Morgan and someone else on, and I thought they were going to discuss Rushdie's works in depth and just Rushdie's health in depth, but instead they kind of, in this automaton way, just springboarded into, well, look what John Stuart Mill wrote about free speech. They used free speech. Of course, they didn't take my brilliant advice from my last video, not calling it free speech, but referring to it as the right to promulgate anything. Of course, they didn't use that term. They used the free speech because no one's ever going to say anything that I say. No one's ever going to kind of echo it and catapult it into the dialectic stratosphere. And I know they won't, but on some level, I'm still kind of disappointed that they don't. Because, I don't know, I guess I'm irrational too. I would even have a tiny little speck of an expectation that if I say something in a video, then maybe, it'll trickle somewhere. They didn't. They just said free speech, and they started talking about, well, John Stuart Mill wrote these brilliant books and essays on free speech centuries ago, and people need to go back to doing that. And it's the same exact thing we've heard on Mar's show dozens, if not hundreds of times. And why? Why do they think if they just repeat that boilerplate yet again, it's like, oh, you will have persuaded someone who believes in, for example, like hate speech, right? Because I guess one marker, if we set aside the issue of the right to promulgate everything, you can listen to me expound on that in the last video. But if we set that aside and we go into this kind of customary debate about free speech, it really is this idea that hate speech laws are incompatible with what is referred to as free speech, whether we want to conceive that as clearly the First Amendment, if we want to stretch it out further. The idea of there being hate speech is incompatible with that. And yes, technically I do agree with everything each and every one of those panelists said, whether it's this last week on Real Time or pretty much any other time someone spouts off on the issue of free speech on Real Time. I do technically agree that hate speech laws, they just shouldn't be on the books. But if I had gone on that show and I have a chance to say something, to contribute something in the wake of this Salman Rushdie stabbing, it was so infuriating and sad to read about that he was on the ventilator for that long. We could have just talked. I wish they would have just spoken about their subjective reactions to that and how angry it made them, but they just launched into these shibboleths about the importance of free speech, a la what John Stuart Mill wrote. If I were alongside those panelists, I would have just said, guys, we've sung this song dozens of times on this show alone, and probably 100. That show's been on for over 20 years now on HBO. So it's like we've done it for so many times. Let's take a different angle, because if you think you're persuading someone who believes in free speech by just spouting those shibboleths again, you're clearly not reading their responses to what you're saying. So let's take it to this different angle about the right to promulgate anything. That's what I would have done, but of course I don't get invited to those sorts of speeches because that's probably not the only thing I would have said. I would have added a bunch more things, and I would have just said, if someone cut in, I would have said, please don't interrupt me, I wasn't finished yet. And then Mar would have probably told me, he's like, hey, you've spoken for over a minute now, it's not your show, buddy, right? Because he does say it in there have been a few long-winded or semi-long-winded panelists who did get a bit of an attitude from Mar. It's like, hey, come on, it's an hour-long show. That's what he says. But he said it's only an hour-long show. Like, someone wants to get deep into a subject, they can't because the host kind of rightly says, there's a format to this thing, and you're not letting me run with the format. We got bits to get to, we got new rules to get to, and we can't do that if you turn this into a seminar. And I guess it's true. Certain shows need a format, but it is frightening when people take those kinds of shows to be kind of the standard bearers for public discourse. Like, have those shows be in effect. I got no problem. Have as many of them as you want, as long as everyone understands that that's nothing close to the standard bearer for dialectics. The dialectic is going to resemble a seminar more than it's going to resemble that show. And I don't think that's something most people realize, because like if you go to the comments, they will say how a lot of the commenters will talk about how refreshing it is to see people just in this freewheeling manner discuss the issues of the week. And I'm like, you think this is discussing the issues of the week in a freewheeling manner? I just see a bunch of constraints. Because if you're discouraged from talking at length, how can that be anything other than a constraint? But I guess the standards are so low because those people are kind of maybe inundated with cable news or whatever else. Mar's show does seem like a breath of fresh air because the standards for them are so low. And then the other problem is just this idea that we need to think about the news of the week as where it's at. And that gets me to a few people that they've just been on my shit list for so long. And I'm gonna go after them in this video because, God, one drawback to uploading so infrequently is I just have so much to unleash in each video, and it's just overwhelming, and it makes me have contempt for people who do this regularly, not just because they don't understand the artistic component of video, something like video making, but also it's because they don't really know what it's like to just have a bunch of things that they've had on the back burner that they don't let out even on a monthly basis, right? The way I don't even upload once a month. And so that just means that I just click the record button and I just explode. Like one issue after another, I just explode because I've just had these things no one else is critiquing it. The only time any of these points are made they're made inside my mind. And yet I just see nothing but redundancy elsewhere. And it's like my irritation index is nothing like other people's irritation index. And so I just don't understand how so many people can be annoyed by the newsy stuff, right? So this thing with Mar-a-Lago, I just spilled a bit of coffee because I'm shaking this cup. Maybe I'll just leave the cup. So there's the Mar-a-Lago scandal, the Mar-a-Lago raid. I've glanced at the articles. Maybe I've read all of 2 articles on it, because I know that this is just another example of something that wants to hijack my attention, some kind of force that is saying to me that this is what you ought to pay. It's important because it involves powerful people, right? We're reporting on powerful people. Therefore, these are noteworthy headlines, and headlines that you not only should glance at, but read in their entirety, the pieces, right, of the headlines. And no, you shouldn't. What do you think any of this stuff is going to amount to? You knowing some amount on it, you knowing everything about it, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. The cookie is going to crumble in whatever way it crumbles. Even if, of all the people paying attention to it, even if half paid attention, even if a quarter of the public, even if a fifth of the public paid attention to it, the cookie is going to crumble in however it crumbles. The amount of people paying attention to it is not going to change anything. Oh, crap. Okay, I got to deal with one thing, and I'll be right back. And I'm back. There's like 5 points I want to make about the Mar-a-Lago thing. That may take up way too much time and make the video way too long, so we'll see if I can segue fascinatingly from one point to the next. Then I may make all 5. And it's not really about the Mar-a-Lago thing itself. It's about the reactions to it. Broadly speaking, 2 reactions, because of course, right? Of course, there'll be 2 very strong reactions. One will be the outrage that this possibly could have even happened to our dear leader's kind of sealed off palace. And then the other one is the reaction of outrage is, what is that thug, criminal, mob boss hiding? Yeah, I just summarized the 2 reactions for you. In case you wanted to people who's been hiding under a rock, who has been able to escape reading about this, because it's just really been that pervasive. It's one of the things the algorithm bombards me the most. I swear there's so many things, but I just click suggest less, suggest less, suggest less, suggest less. It's going to be a video where I'm probably just screenshotting all the things I'm clicking suggest less on, and yet the algorithm still bombards me with it. But at the top of that list are just these Trumpy scandal things. I got fed up with them before the 2016 election. I just thought there was just that much being overdone in terms of the Trump scandals. Like, I get it. He's not the best person to give power to. I get it. But it doesn't matter. I have no power over the algorithm. But in this last week, the tidal wave has been especially bad. So I just want to complain about it, because there's these two strong negative reactions. And of course, the reactions are always strong. No one ever thinks to ask, well, like, why? What is this? Like, kind of the old Morrissey line, but it says nothing to be about my life. Like, no one says that this has nothing to be about my life. And if you actually do think that whichever Trump scandal we're talking about says something to you, however indirectly, about your life, you've been taken for a ride. And it's just another example that just kind of doesn't just remind you, but it just kind of smacks me over the face with the realization of just how different people's irritation indexes are from my own. And I can see where they are, because it's where I used to be. There's a couple of years, you get into politics, those first couple of years, the thing that the headline wants you to be outraged about, you are outraged about. It doesn't have to take a clear-cut partisan turn, but often it would. And it's just so clear to me that there's nothing to truly be outraged about here, or really when it comes to anything else. The moment you realize that there are going to be oceans of ink spilled on it, I don't understand how you can be someone who's been around the block enough times and still feel that rage. Like, the only time I feel, whether it's just rage or something non-rageful like mere irritation, like, the only time I read something and end up walking away irritated is when I just know that it's the specific counterpoint I want to make is just not going to be made by anyone. It is just really yet another thing that makes me question, how is it that I have the same sort of mammalian brain as my fellow Homo sapiens? Because even the smartest and even the wisest among them, they come nothing close to having my irritation index. Like, they will be irritated when it's just let's say they actually believe that Trump is hiding something. And I guess there's some reason, I haven't read much about it, but apparently they gave warning after warning for him to return these assets before they finally raided the place. I haven't double checked that, but I just heard it written about by people I trust, chief among them being David Frum. I think David Frum has been strong. His track record of commenting on Trump has been strong. So I just round off to trusting him, but I'm not trusting him unconditionally. And so let's say that David Frum is right, and we've all proved it. Trump has been given ample opportunity to return these documents. He has declined to do so, and so that's why the raid happened. And so now people are pissed off. What is Trump hiding? The fact that he can actually trickle into your affective states, anything that's going on in the news cycle, despite you knowing that a huge chunk of the country is going to be howling for justice over it. This can take the angle of someone who believes he's hiding something, or it can take the angle of someone who recognizes that, holy crap, it's more deep state meddling with Trump's, sealed off palace. But I just see anger, and I just don't understand how you can be around the block for more than a couple of years and still let your emotions be pulled in by this sort of stuff. The only time, if you're going to tell me you are clued in, especially you're clued into the way media deceives people, don't fucking talk to me about how you're clued in when it comes to that stuff, and then take your affective marching orders from one or another media outlet. Because that's exactly what you people do. Whether you're sitting out here crying Trump derangement syndrome for years, or whether you are perpetrating Trump derangement syndrome for years, you're still letting the media tell you what kind of affective states you should inhabit day in and day out. Because it's so clear to these people. The term I've been trying to spread on it, that I've absolutely failed, but the term that I've been trying to spread but I don't think I've ever said it in a single video, so this is yet another thing I want to throw into a video. Really, it's not about a Trump derangement syndrome. Everyone is suffering from a Trump engagement syndrome. And God damn it, I can't believe it's August 2022 and I'm only now mentioning this term because I've thought about it years ago now, but it's really something that someone should push. Everyone is suffering from a Trump engagement syndrome. They are engaging these things. If you want to pay attention to them, fine, but I don't see how you can be anything other than fully unsurprised. And when you're unsurprised, you're not supposed to be angry. If your life or well-being or, just home or some of your neighborhood's coming under attack or something, then be flustered, then be panicked, then be worried. But to do so, especially when they've said the sky's about to fall so many times in the context of American politics, whether they want to talk about we have to save our democracy or whether they want to talk about Flight 96, that famous op-ed that was kind of, we should vote for Trump in 2016. There was that famous Flight 95, whichever was the 9/11 flights. Like that, they titled the op-ed the Flight 90 something. It was 95 or 96 to say that this is like the last chance to save the republic, right? So one side will say we got to save the democracy. The other side will say we got to save the republic. And it's like, how many times can you hear a pundit cry wolf? Probably disingenuously, before you stop letting your affective states get sucked into it. You shouldn't go as far as me. And the place I am right now is, I recognize that there is a Trump engagement syndrome. And so I'll just glance at the headlines and I'll click suggest less, or I'll click do not recommend. And it doesn't matter how many times I click that, the algorithm will keep bombarding me with it. But I'm not even saying you have to go as far as me. Maybe you should read. Maybe I'm wrong to actually click suggest less. Maybe I should read, maybe I should be informed. But where I'm absolutely confident that I am right is when I see people get unnerved and furious about it. And especially the Trumpy people who've kind of outdone themselves in the last week or so with the fury, threatening civil war, right? I mean, Steven Crowder, I think the day after the news came out, Steven Crowder was just dead serious. It wasn't performative. Like he said, it's wartime. And I think he meant it at the time too, right? But as we came to find out, wartime just meant, I'll just do another show tomorrow. That's pretty much what it means. Like, I'll just do another show tomorrow, or if you're a podcaster, another podcast tomorrow, and maybe I'll speak in a little more of a shouty voice throughout the podcast. That's essentially what Bannon did, just kind of up the shoutiness factor. But I think they do believe when they say to themselves, like, this means war, and we're going to march. And maybe they will march, but like, how pathetic is it if someone actually believes, like, that's how indebted you are to your dear leader, that you're willing to literally visit violence upon, not even those feds, but maybe the people who are just saying that feds aren't to blame for this, that this is just what the political doctor ordered, or what the constitutional doctor ordered, the raid. Because that's what, when you're calling for a civil war, you are saying that pretty much everyone who does not disagree with you on this specific thing that you're so furious about, those people deserve to have violence visited upon them. And like, if there is a Trump derangement syndrome, there absolutely is. But I think that this last week has proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that the Trump engagement syndrome, which just hypnotizes everyone who is engaging with these stories and spouting off publicly, that's far more potent. Not just in terms of the number of people it afflicts on an absolute level, but the number of strangling it does. This is a kind of psychological strangling that I see. People don't understand they're having their psychology strangled by being so into this stuff, to the point where they think it makes sense to go fight wars with their fellow countrymen, or with anyone really, because a place got raided, right? That's what happened, right? A place got raided. And whatever you believe factually, right? I can't stress that enough. It doesn't matter what you believe factually about the justifiability or urgency or the unjustifiability of raiding his place. It shouldn't even get you ticked off, let alone threatening civil war. If you're threatening civil war, you're a cultist. And likewise, if you were unnerved by it, if you're like spending your time not worrying about what I'm worrying about, the deterioration of independent thought, seemingly getting worse by the week. For me, it seems like it's getting worse. That's not what you're unnerved about, and how your irritation index doesn't even come anywhere close to resembling anyone else's irritation index. But no, you're worrying that Trump might be hiding something. The same goes for you. And so that's not a both sides thing. That's just I'm exasperated by how alienating everything on the internet is. I am afraid to click videos. I've got this guy, Naturalist Ted. I'm stuck to him. He's got this paper that's written by a philosopher of sorts, who's written about, how there is no void after death. Death really is just the discontinuation of consciousness. It's a decent paper, but this Naturalist Ted guy, I got to respond to his video because I haven't even clicked it yet, but I know, because he keeps saying things like the futility of antinatalism, or something and this is why antinatalism is wrong. And what he did is he's just on this rampage because he read this paper and he thinks this paper would clarify so many things, so many kind of philosophical points of confusion, because someone says there's, people get kind of poetic about what happens after you die, the great unknown. They use words like the great void often. And so this philosopher pretty much wanted to clear up those kinds of confusions that are prevalent even among the secularists, even among, I guess, some materialists. And so, because that pretty much is actually hard to argue, somehow that has implications for bringing people into existence, just as it would when it comes to it having implications when people coming out of existence, right? So if you think as antinatalism is kind of dead on arrival because of that, you really do have to point out how being opposed to just simply brutally tormenting someone to death is also not implicated by stuff like this, because, well, consciousness just comes and goes. Consciousness, really, what he wants to say, and I'm not going to attribute this position to him because I don't know whether he said it because I haven't watched his videos yet, but really, the problem is then not with antinatalism. The problem is with what Rawls wrote about when he wrote about the separateness of persons and how this has major implications for ethics. And so, really, eliminative materialism, not standard forms of materialism, but kind of taking materialism to its ultimate end. Sometimes this is referred to as eliminativism. You have to really be a nominalist about abstract objects and universals. So you have to really believe that persons and personhood, we can talk about that, but really that is as delusional if you believe that persons exist as these metaphysical unities. It's just kind of believing that colors exist as opposed to just these different wavelengths that our eyes decode as color, but they're actually nothing like. The redness doesn't exist in the universe, blueness doesn't exist in the universe. So there's a way to get kind of pedantic, just rhetorically pedantic about that. And likewise, the way we can do that with color schemes and various other things that eliminative materialists are really keen to get people to do. We can get that way about, or we can try. Some people want to get us to try to do that when it comes to personhood and therefore the separateness of persons. And so coming into existence, coming out of existence, well, there's just these repositories of value. But because personhood doesn't really exist, strictly speaking, personhood carries no value, and antinatalism is disqualified on arrival because antinatalism concerns itself with persons, just like in any ordinary practical ethical sense, right? Just assaulting someone, putting them in the ICU, the intensive care unit, right? Well, you just incurred a bunch of ouchies on this consciousness, but we really should think of consciousness as a blob, as good, proper, eliminative materialists. So you didn't really do anything wrong, right? Because people come in and out of existence, within the existence, their conscious states, it's kind of interchangeable with, like, person A's conscious states are interchangeable with person B's conscious states. So that also doesn't matter. So you can see the problems to this sort of stuff. I'm not going to get into it much further, but I will click on that guy's video and see if what I sniff out based on his title and based on his absolute fascination with his paper, if he's going to try to use that to justify the title of that video, which is essentially saying anti-natalism is dead on arrival. Because the only way it can be dead on arrival is if bearers of value and disvalue are infinite, and personhood is really just a repository for value. It doesn't carry its own component of value, as eliminative materialists would want to have us believe. But I think that those positions have a lot going against them, and certainly a lot of just commonsensically, intuitively as well. Like, even if I believe that there was going to be this, as someone who aggregates, right? I do, a huge chunk of my ethical thinking has to do with its quantitative aspects and has to do with aggregation and stuff like that. But even I would say, if you just give me absolute proof that there will be an infinite supply of people who will come into existence, like, I still wouldn't think that therefore, because that quantity of this value is infinite, that therefore whether or not I assault the person right next to me, that like I should just do it for kicks and giggles, because it's not going to change. Like, a finite increase is not going to make a difference in an otherwise infinite supply of a bad thing, right? So you can finitely increase the disvalue within a person by beating them into a bloody pulp, right? And so I guess to some extent a thoroughgoing aggregationist would therefore say, well, it doesn't matter whether you pummel them or not, because the supply of this value is infinite, because the supply of bearers of intrinsic disvalue is likewise infinite, right? And so, as you can see how perverse that way of thinking is when it comes to the decision of whether you should just assault someone for kicks and giggles because there'll be an infinite amount of suffering in the universe anyway, you can see how it's every bit as perverse to think that that's a shrewd way with which to dismiss questions of bringing people into existence when we can establish this asymmetry a la Johann Frick's paper that I converted into a video 2 videos ago. But yeah, that's his video. So I just see things like that where it's just the title feels like I'm afraid to go to my subscriptions page just because just the way people title their videos, I'm like, that's another thing for me to file into my head as something that needs a response. And it's just more internet homework. And I've got so much internet homework as it is, I can't even take on the load in terms of the informal assignment. Because I have my formal assignment, things that I take screenshots of, things that I make little notes of, and there's just so much. That bucket list of things to respond to is getting longer instead of shorter as time goes on. It's been getting longer instead of shorter. And now it's just gotten to the point where I can't, I'm afraid to even click on a video or even to check my subscriptions page, because it just immediately rattles me to see and even like people making short videos on incredibly complex, timeless, thorny subjects. It just screams that person hasn't done enough reading, because there's no way to do enough reading on a subject and to think that you're going to cover the subject with any degree of adequacy by treating it in a 10-minute video. And yet so many people think that's what they're doing. Like, if it's one of these heavy-hitting philosophical topics, you should know that it's a 30-minute minimum video to kind of take on the anticipated counterpoints, the sorts that I might lunge at you. But the naturalist Ted videos, his videos like between 5 to 10 minutes long, and he just so kind of calmly just spouts out. It's just so clear that what he thinks, this paper about what exactly happens after death, which is nothing happens after death from a consciousness standpoint. Consciousness simply ceases. Like, he really thinks that by shoehorning that into procreative ethics, he's being insightful, and that all the rest of us are wrong. And it's every bit as uninsightful as it is with whether or not I should just pummel the next random person I see into a bloody pulp and kill them, right? On the grounds that suffering could very well be infinite, because an infinite amount of people may come into existence. It's like, it still doesn't matter. That person's own personhood-bounded suffering is finite. And we can decrease that, and that's what matters. And so just as it matters when it comes to ordinary harms that benefit, it matters when it comes to the standpoint of existential harms. So that's just an example. There's so many of these types of examples where I see stuff. I see that I was in Mendham's thumbnail, and I'm doubly afraid to click that because Mendham is especially prone to attributing things to me that he doesn't do it maliciously. He just does it because he's got no business uploading videos. Like, he's so bored in his videos. It's so clearly autopilot, and yet he's still out there making videos. And so I click, and as I see that, there I am in the corner of his video from a couple of what the fucks ago. It's like, I can't click this. I have way too many things on my bucket list. I can't take on an amendment video where God knows what he's going to say and what kind of quirky things he's going to attribute to me and the points I'm making in that last video. But eventually, I'm going to have to get around to it because it's not fair to leave him hanging in case he said something that he was looking feedback for. But I just, like, right now, no. There's way too many other things that I need to get to. Way too many other things. I need to get back to doing my loose ends style videos. I did like one loose ends in 2017 and another one in 2019, and I didn't go back to that. What is this now? This has been going on for long. Yeah, the loose ends was a good way to get these kind of bucket list things off my radar. But this won't be a loose ends because I was a bit too stuck to certain themes, and it doesn't work as a loose ends. My coffee's gone cold, and cold coffee tastes disgusting. God, people who get what do you call it? The iced cappuccino, frappuccinos. I don't understand those people. So what else do I need to do? Oh yeah, so I was before I launched into these tirades, I was going to talk about the thing that really should capture our attention. I'm just so past these partisan divides, and I'm past any other kinds of divides that are about some issues themselves. Right now, the people who are on my shit list more than anyone else, like if I were going to draw some absolute boundaries between like in-group, out-group. So this is in-group, out-group according to my standards and tastes. It is the Newsy People who ought to be the out-group. The Andrew Sullivans, I guess Douglas Murray to some extent, he's always kind of just, well, what's Newsy? I'm going to write about that. The Matt Taibbis, because what they do is they portray themselves as these self-styled thinkers, because I guess they have been unceremoniously booted from their platforms that they existed in. I think with Andrew Sullivan, I think he was on the New York Times for a long time, and if not the New York Times, it was another one of these New York, maybe the New York magazine. I'll double check that and insert the correction if I'm wrong. But yeah, he had one too many kind of lack of tolerance for the intersectional stuff that's been more and more influential on the New York Times or New York Mag editorial board. So they didn't tolerate that. They kept complaining about him, and then he's pretty much been elbowed out, and he's gone to Substack. Matt Taibbi's at Substack. A good number of people are at Substack, and if they just relinquish this is where you go for the self-styled thinkers, for people who think outside the box. It's true that they think outside the box. It's just they fail to realize that it's just one box. So they've gone from level 1 to level 2. But there's so many additional boxes that one needs to think outside of. And because they've gotten past the first one, we've been excommunicated from mainline media outlets, therefore we're the outside the box thinkers. So kudos to you. I'll pat you on the back of the head for that, because you did do that. Congratulations. It's not even a disingenuous congratulations. It's a legitimate congratulations that someone like Andrew Sullivan was unwilling to put up with the stuff that the New York Times or the New York Mag wanted him to put up with. It's good. So it's better that he's at a place like Substack. Ditto with Matt Taibbi, ditto with the rest of them. But what's absolutely unacceptable is their branding. Their branding that this is where the clued in people go. This is where the people who have zero tolerance for shibboleths go. Because it's not. Because what it is all these people are still the Newsy People. not even just political, because you can be newsy without being political. So I don't want people to think that this is what I talked about in the last video. In the last video, I was too presumptuous, not too presumptuous, but I talked about novelty versus redundancy. In comments, there were a couple of people who gave me pushback, rightfully so. I expounded on that, so it's not just about redundancy and novelty. So I cleaned up some of that in the video, but boy, when it comes to apolitical versus political commentary, that's not even the way the line ought to be drawn. The line really ought to be drawn when it comes to all these people who are over-reporting on newsy things. The internet has never had this much of a lopsided ratio when it comes to. It's just got me to think because of this. Just everyone losing their shit about the Mar-a-Lago raid, and like, how many of these scandals are going to happen until you guys just get deflated by it, and until you start realizing that some of the most interesting things that all of us need to be discussing are the things that just no one's discussing. You know, things about how, you know, it took us a long time to realize certain things simply because no one was around in our youth to just articulate it for us. A couple of those things I talked about at length in the last video. And it's just like, you can roam Substack to your heart's content. It's not going to give you that. It's going to give you a better spin, sometimes a better spin, when it comes to the newsy stuff in comparison to the kind of mainline news. But it's not going to go beyond that. And for me to, setting aside those kinds of things, for me to truly echo even the things that they're talking about in terms of just the issues themselves and portraying all these things, it's like a foregone conclusion, because a lot of the stuff on Substack, for example, it's just this endless discussion about how, well, the virus really did originate from the Wuhan lab, and here's why. And then it's hyperlinks to something else. And likewise, like the average op-ed in The Atlantic, well, it's like the virus really did originate from the wet markets, and here's a hyperlink that shows why, beyond reasonable doubt, foregone conclusion. And what these people, if they're going to insert this, they don't even need to say something like beyond reasonable doubt. It can just be a vibe that only the gullible will not agree with how obvious this is, like the origin of the virus, right? So the first thing I would want to say is, like, who gives a fuck, right? How much time have you spent reading up on this? That's the very first thing you're supposed to, like, come to the debate with. The first thing, before you tell me what you go on to conclude, how much time have you read? How much time do you think a person who has strong views on this, what's the minimal amount of hours they should have spent reading up on the origin of the virus, the Wuhan theory versus the wet market theory? Like, no one puts these kinds of metrics into effect. It's like, what is a reasonable amount of time you should be researching this? But everyone kind of has this vibe about them where it's like, if you don't agree with the conclusions I've reached, well, you're just too gullible, you're just too easy to manipulate by either the kind of hoodlum media outlets, the uncredentialed ones, versus the mainline ones. And no, first of all, tell me how much time you spend, roughly speaking. You can estimate it, or if you kept tabs on it, tell me the exact numbers. And then, more to the point, show me step by step, procedurally, from the time you log on, right? What you do in your investigation process, and where exactly along the lines of that process do you think the smoking gun is? Because all these people, if they're arguing something that's newsy, whether it's the clear-cut root cause of why the Mar-a-Lago thing happened, like the deep state or Trump hiding something, like just tell me from the time you log online. Just record everything you do that comprises your investigation process. And I think if you actually do that, at any point along those stages, you single out the main course, that is the smoking gun, you'll start realizing that you don't have the smoking gun, you have the social trust model of belief formation. it's just you trust certain people more and other people less. If you think what's happened to Trump is because they've had it out for him from day one, it's probably going to be used as something banned instead of this podcast. So you will have heard it from him directly, or it ricocheted to some other kinds of wherever. It may have ricocheted to God knows where. Maybe as far as InfoWars, and so you've heard someone on InfoWars say it, Breitbart, wherever. The MAGA ecosystem is a fairly broad ecosystem, as it should be. It shouldn't have been resignated to sewers. They should have a presence on Twitter. They should have a presence everywhere they want to have a presence. But just understand that your vibe, you don't even have to say it in a clear way. You could just give off these vibes that people are hopelessly deluded because they can't agree with you. And that's a kind of Trump engagement syndrome. But what it is more is it is you are a recipient without realizing it. You are a recipient of the social trust model of belief formation. And that's fine as long as you haven't deluded yourself into thinking like you've got the smoking gun that shows what actually happened. You just trust some people more than others. You just trust a figure like Bannon more than you trust a figure like David Frum. And that's fine. We can get into who's more trustworthy versus not, but then we actually have to get into those people's track records. And I'm perfectly willing to do that. But that's even jumping the gun, unless you understand that that's what drives your vibes belief. Like there's the vibes theory of politics. And the best way to even just cut that out is just not to overcommit or to commit at all into having a view on this stuff. So like I just read minimally on this sort of stuff, so I just don't have a view. It's not that I just don't have a strong view. I just don't even have a view. Partly because I on arrival trust nothing in the sewer that is the MAGA ecosystem media space, right? But then I also know that I really shouldn't trust the feds. And a lot of this stuff will originate from the feds. And you don't have to have a theory of the deep state to believe that a lot of times the feds aren't going to be trustworthy. And they are going to be opportunistic. And whether it's the Russia probe or just something else, you should have reservations, right? Because just because the people who are spinning the opposite story are flagrant liars, pathological liars, compulsive liars, there's many different breeds of liars in the MAGA media space. That doesn't mean that, at least when it comes to certain half-truths, the feds and the mainline media, who are clearly invested in not having another Trump term, they're going to be, at the least, you should be able to open yourself up to the possibility that these people are going to be spinning a lot of half-truths, right? If there's 30 things that happen within a single week, let's say, that are politically relevant, that implicate, let's say, Democrats and Republicans, but they implicate, like 28 of those things, let's say, implicate the Republicans negatively, and only 2 of them implicate Democrats negatively. Here we can talk about Democratic politicians or party operatives, or even, some kind of visible activists who are kind of superstars within the party. So it doesn't just have to be the politicians, but if there are 30 things that happen, 28 of which will hurt the red side, only 2 of which will hurt the blue side. Like if Tucker Carlson fixates on those 2 things in his nightly news segment, like he doesn't have to be a liar. Like every single word he can say about those 2 things that he's covering can be true. Where he would go wrong is by way of his sins of omission. That how convenient, Tucker. There's these 28 other things that happen that implicate the red side, but you're not talking about them. Night after night, you're just fixating conveniently on these 2 things that implicate the blue side. But so often people, when they give pushback to Tucker, it's like, he's a liar. Well, he may be a liar, but there's a lot of things that he does say that are absolutely true, that you should just say these things are true. And then call him out for the things that he conveniently ignores. And so that's why I would just kind of use that to back up what I said about why I don't have a strong view on this stuff. It's because it's hard to come across someone who is reporting on something like this without being a cheerleader. And even if they're not a cheerleader, even if they're trying their best to do just the facts, man, the news that they're going to be getting is going to be, their source is going to be someone else who seems to then, because of the social trust model of belief formation, you can have an honest broker who is convinced that the person who's on the ground, that they're getting their news from because they like that person, because they may have a mutual respect between the two of them, they're going to likewise believe that that person is also an honest broker. And that person may also be an honest broker, but then there may be someone else who is closer to the heart of the matter, who's on the ground, who may be actually a Fed, and that person is a bit more implicated on having a kind of long-term agenda. And none of us should be the least bit surprised if the Feds, in this case, they have some other kind of marching orders that they're obeying. That's not just the facts, man. There's other things in the cards here. Like if you're just shocked by that, then you are not just a recipient of, you're not just immersed in the Trump engagement syndrome, but then a subcategory of the Trump engagement syndrome is the Trump derangement syndrome that we've heard everyone talk about for, well, several years now. So, yeah, I wish more people used something like Trump engagement syndrome, but that doesn't mean that we should never use something like the Trump derangement syndrome. Derangement would be if your jaw would just be on the floor to find out that there's some scurvy motives behind stuff like this Mar-a-Lago raid. I'm actually exhausted. I'm going to rewatch this and then add stuff to it if need be. But yeah, I kind of went on here.